Hello, everyone. So we are joining Dr. Wagner once again for the Wagner on Ethics and Leadership series. And Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for making the time to join me. I am one of your students or former students at the UH Clear Lake doctoral program for higher education leadership. And thank you so much for taking the time to enlighten me and the world on the topic of ethics and leadership.
My pleasure.
Dr. Wagner, today I would like for us to talk about leadership, ethics, and schools. You know, in your books, you've said this is a search for clarity. What do you mean by that, and how does that relate to the inherent moral nature of leadership?
Well, one thing that often happens when people talk about morals and ethics and so on today is that their speech lacks clarity. Let's just start with the words morals and ethics. For about 150 years, if you had looked in college catalogs before the 1960s, you would see that courses could have been offered in morals or ethics, and they were the same courses because each word was considered to be synonymous. Morals or ethics was meant to be simply a set of rules that prescribe or prohibit certain behavior. And then the course was about how do you figure out which morals or which ethic rules are right-minded. Then beginning around the 1970s, sociologists kind of took control over a lot of it, and they wanted to distinguish between ethics as being rules that are used in an organization or a community from morals, which they wanted to say are something that are personal to people. And I don't know if that was a good distinction to make, because if people have morals in mind that are different from the ethics of whatever community or organization that they're in, you're going to find nothing but confusion coming from how the people try to operate together. Let's talk about a little bit more about clarity of moral terms, because that's essential to people successfully sharing in moral thinking. Take a word like fair. If I were to ask you what the word fair means, there's a good chance you would quickly pop your hand up and say, oh, that means treating everybody equally. Yet, if you think about it, one of the most unfair things you can do is treat everybody equally. If a group of us on our desert island, there's 50 of us there, and one person gets sick, and the medic brings out this large hypodermic needle and fills it with penicillin and gives the person who's sick a shot. And as they're putting their equipment away, there'd be something odd, would there not, about somebody present who says, wait a minute, if you're going to give that person a shot, you need to give all of us a shot because that's only fair. And I'm quite sure the other 48 people would be going, oh, no, 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 no. That's the worst thing you could do. If we don't need the medicine, we shouldn't be getting a shot. Aristotle gave us a great definition of fairness when he said, fairness is a matter of treating equals equally and unequals unequally. In schools, we know that there is a disproportionate amount of budgeting that goes to special needs children, whether they be gifted or whether they suffer some sort of learning disability. But we spend more money on them than we do on the majority of the students that we call the so-called normal students or whatever. And that is justified because it takes more money to give the special needs students the same access to opportunity at the end of it all as it does with the so-called normal students. Equality is simply about treating everybody the same. And it's not often fair to treat everybody the same because people are different. And the only fair thing to do is to acknowledge those differences. Men and women are different in terms of the restroom facilities that they need to have available to them. And no one is insisting that those facilities be made exactly the same for both genders. Our physiology requires us to uh, attend to those differences when we're attending to an equal need we all have that nature imposed upon us to go ahead and use laboratories from time to time. Another couple of words that are really important when we recognize that morality is bigger than just talking about rules as ethical rules or moral rules. Morality is bigger and more foundational, and it is supported by certain inclination humans have to applaud or condemn what somebody else may or may not be doing in our community. So let me take two simple words along those lines. One word is the word shame, and the other word is ashamed. Now, again, just as was the case with fairness and equality, the knee-jerk reaction may be to say, well, aren't those two words the same? And they're not at all. When you shame somebody, you're denouncing them, you're humiliating them. And you can shame somebody who's innocent, in fact, and that wouldn't be the right thing to do. But in our community, we do shame those who defect, who, in a sense, turn their back on communal cooperation, and we shame them with the idea that hopefully without physical force or whatever, we can bring to the attention of everyone present, the defector and others as well, the communal dissatisfaction with that person's behavior, which was so costly to everyone else. That's shaming somebody. In contrast, us shaming is something that the individual feels alone. So you're able to take a few cents out of the office coffee kitty, and no one saw you do it. You got away with it, but there's a good chance that you would feel ashamed for what you did. Ashamed and guilt, feeling guilt, are very close to one another. Being ashamed is feeling guilt for what you did, for what you recognize as being a wrongdoing. Well, what was so wrongdoing? Was it breaking a rule? It might have been. But more profoundly, what makes it a wrongdoing is that it represents a defection from community, a failure to cooperate.
Wow, very profound indeed. Nicely said. What does that mean? What do you mean when, in your book, in chapter 1 there, you mentioned, leader as a moral architect. What do you mean by that?
Well, you may remember from our last session, I mentioned Eisenhower's talking about a leader as someone others will follow. And so, because a leader is someone that others will follow, they're not following along like they might do with a boss, but they are literally following. They see in the leader somebody who is worthy of being followed. And so that means that the sort of patterns and the virtues that the leader exhibits are things that become role modeled by others. A fine psychologist years ago, in fact, he became president of the American Psychological Association. His name was Albert Bandura, and he talked a great deal about role modeling. And it is one of the most potent forces in all of human nature. We role model. You might ask yourself this question: what is the first job of every child? Now ponder that for a moment. And different ideas may come to mind, but here's what I think is the first job of every child. Again, I'm going to rely back on what we know from evolution. The first job of every child is to become an adult. And that's pretty much ubiquitous across all mammalian nature. And so from the moment they hit the ground, they're watching and they're role modeling. So the leader is somebody that others are likely to role model because if you're willing to follow this person, you see them as being virtuous enough, charming enough, that personable enough that you want to somehow capture some of those traits within you. If you saw the leader as being scandalous in some way, you might follow along, but it's unlikely you would want to adapt those sorts of principles as the way that you guide your life over the long term, and particularly as you engage those who are most important to you, family and neighbors and so on.
Dr. Wagner, I find that example and the realistic example of children wanting to be adults, and they do that by watching others. Such a meaningful thought personally, because with two boys of my own, you may not always remember, but they're watching and learning from you. That's well said, and something that I think all educators and all parents have to be aware of. That our kids, they're learning from us.
Yeah, it brings several things to mind. I mean, just to add some more examples, uh, how many children have sat in their parents' car? There's no key in the car, but they sat in a car and they pretended that they were driving somewhere. Now, without a key in the car, they're not going to go anywhere. And why would they choose that as being something that would be an entertainment, something that they should spend their time on? Well, because it role models becoming an adult. There's no surprise that children who are around parents who do a lot of yelling tend to be children who do a lot of yelling when they're dissatisfied with playmates. And children who are around parents who are very kind and considerate of others tend to be more kind and considerate of their playmates, again, because they've been role modeling what's around them. Now, to add to that, in our world, much that gets role modeled comes across YouTube, comes across social media, and comes across television. And so it's no longer just parents or teachers, but it's also what we see on various forms of media. The more important a television show, the more influential certain characters may be in terms of their role modeling effect on children. And so we need to be very conscientious about what we allow our children to watch. And in education, we don't have control over what happens at home, so we can't control what the children watch at home. But what we can do is think carefully about what we use as examples when we talk to children about various matters of human engagement. There's a tendency for every teacher to want to be popular. And to be popular, you think you need to be hip. And so you want to use examples of rock stars or whatever that the students may identify with. That may be bad advice. How many of those rock stars are really moral paradigms of what you would like children to become? So teachers need to be disengaged from being hip and more attentive to, if you're going to select role models to draw their attention to, pick out role models that if the kids did role model those things, they would, in all likelihood, tend to become more cooperative with one another and with all of us in society in general.
Thank you for that. In your book, Dr. Wagner, you have more architecture stands alone as a key word. What do you mean by that, sir?
Well, when you think about architecture, you're thinking about what goes on a plan, usually a blueprint of some kind, and there's no building yet, right? You've got a site that you plan on building on that site, but the architecture precedes any building. Let me repeat that. The architecture precedes any building. Going back to our last session, we talked about the foundational role of cooperation, and that at the heart of cooperation was the invention of the promise. Those are elements of architecture that have to be in place before you build any set of rules, laws, policies, or practices. The ethical rules, the moral rules, the policies, and the practices should all flow out and reflect the foundational commitment we have to cooperation and to the idea of preserving networks of promises amongst all of us that obligate us to one another and that can only be excused under special conditions that all would recognize would be excusable breaches of cooperation, such as they may lead to danger towards somebody or whatever. But in moral architecture, what you want to have the leader present, and not in a lecture, but present by how they behave, how they live their life, um, in such a way that others go, this is the way we do things around here, with or without the rules. Let's make it simple. Leaders who are quick to say please and thank you. Leaders who are not given to gossip. Leaders who shy away from spreading rumors. And there's no laws against any of that. And there may not even be any policies prohibiting that in whatever organization a person might be in. But the leader who avoids those types of things, or who does say please and thank you, and here, let me help you with that, is creating an architecture that the rules that you ultimately make up, the policies you ultimately make up, are just, they're almost a footnote to the moral environment that's there. Do not confuse moral architecture with shared vision. Shared vision is something that is more locally applicable to the organization. Is this organization a stock brokerage firm? Is it an elementary school? Is it a platoon of soldiers in combat? The shared vision will vary in all of those, and yet the moral foundation in each of those may very well be the same. The moral architecture may be what preserves each of those different organizations I just mentioned, regardless of the specific rules that you have in place. Etiquette, rules of etiquette, and other social conventions are not morality themselves, and they're not part of the network of promising specifically. But what they do is they support the courtesies, support our cooperating with one another. And in that moral architecture, if somebody greets you kindly and says, well, how are you today? That just the right thing to do is to respond similarly. I'm fine, how are you? To respond rudely would be to be a defector. It's not even to break any rule. There's no rule that says you have to say, I'm fine, how are you? But that convention has emerged in certain cultures and societies. And we all know that what it does is grease the wheels of keeping us together. That's moral architecture. Are you going to role model? Are you going to live a virtuous life? Look at how disappointed we get when we find out that some religious leader that we favored wound up doing something awful. And we're going, how could this fellow or this lady who we thought so much of behave in this way? Or a political leader, and we thought, well, I wanted to stand behind this person. I wanted to vote for this person, but now I've found out that this person behaved in this way or that way that everybody recognizes as being a defection from our commitment to one another in cooperative community fashion. It's being a leader does mean role modeling a virtuous life, and virtue is what unfolds from understanding the idea that it's a network of promising that keeps us all together.
Can you distinguish between the meta ethical and prescriptive morality?
Yeah, that's philosophical jargon. It's important to philosophers. That may not be important to the average listener here, but meta-ethics is the study of the language that is used to talk about matters of morality. When you're doing meta-ethics, you're not worried about whether or not it's good to be kind to orphans and widows. You're talking about how the language of what you ought or ought not to do works. Um, Prescriptive morality. Anytime that you're trying to figure out what I ought to do in this specific case, if you are able to conclude your thinking successfully, what you have done is come up with a prescription. Like when you're feeling sick and you call up the doctor and he says, well, take 2 aspirin and some orange juice and call me in the morning if you don't feel better. That's a prescription. And when we're thinking about matters of morality, perhaps you have noticed a colleague at work who seems to be uh, a little bit careless in familiarity that he shows to certain students, and you're just a little uncomfortable with the um, perhaps lack of professionalism in that situation. And so, what you want to do is to um, there have been no rules violated, we'll say, or at least that you know of, but we do want to somehow make things a little bit better. We want to do a better job of leading virtuously. You know, when you act that way toward, that student or that handful of students, what do you suppose is the message you're sending to the other students? What do you suppose is the message you're sending to me and other colleagues? Do you think you could serve us better? Lead us, perhaps, if you're an administrator of some kind. Lead us better by acting a little bit more um, in a deliberate, socially conscientious fashion, exhibiting etiquette that shows you care about the niceties, the courtesies that tend to engender respect of one person toward another.
So it's not just talk, is actually doing.
It starts from here and works its way up through the mind and then out.
So any do's and don'ts of communal moral life uh, that you can quickly point out?
Well, obviously, you can't sustain the network of promising for long if you do not show respect toward others. In fact, when you think about the concept of a defector, remember a defector is willing to break promises simply for self-interest. Well, if you're willing to break promises simply for self-interest, I think that also shows a lack of respect for the other people that you're working with or that you engage. And so, from the get-go, one of the things that falls out of this understanding of that it's a network of promising that obligates us and allows us to sustain community and organizations of all sorts. Respect has to be a part of that. Um, Integrity has to be a part of that. And people count on you roughly being the kind of person you present yourself as the next time they see you. If you look like you're putting on masks from moment to moment, that may generate a suspicion on a part of others, and they'd be less likely to trust you. So, to ensure trustworthiness, you try to exhibit integrity. Once upon a time, doing consulting a long time ago, I met with a major officer in one of the world's large corporations. I was there to advise him on strategic planning. Now, this fellow had taken me out for lunch, and that's when the people who hire you often try to tell a consultant on what they really want you to find. But in this organization, they had just cut back on entitlements for their employees. Instead of having the insurance policy that they had, now they switched over to HMOs, and people were fixed on those HMOs. You could buy into a PPO, but the people at the bottom income levels didn't have that as an option, really. So a lot of people resented what went on in the corporation as it made these cost-cutting moves, and so morale was a bit low. And this fellow had asked me, I think we have a morale problem. And I said, yeah, I think you do too, and custody and parliament cutbacks and so on. And he said, well, what can I do about it? And I said, the think about what would make you follow somebody else as a leader. And so we started coming up with the normal jargon that we find in the educational literature, that we find in the business management literature, and so on. And to each one of these in terms, I would say, no, I don't think that'll do it. And he would come up with another one, and I would say, no, I don't think that would do it either. And so finally he said, well, what do you think it would take to get me to follow somebody else? And I said, you would follow somebody else that you recognize as having integrity. And he paused for a moment and he said, you know, you're right. And I said, I think it's the most important thing of leadership. It's what establishes what I call moral architecture. And he never heard me use that term before. And then he said, and I was so disappointed in this. Then he said, almost chirping as he said it, a big grin on his face, and he said, so how do I convince them I got integrity? At that point, I knew the cause was lost because you can't fake integrity. You can resonate integrity. People see you're a person of integrity through and through. It's like your heartbeat. It's there. It's part of you. You can't fake it. You can't fake it any more than you can think your heart into an arrhythmia or back into a regular heartbeat. It just isn't that malleable. So if you want to be a person of integrity, you've got to live as a person of integrity.
Dr. Wagner, so this great conversation related to the truth and moral commitment.
Right. There's what Ravi is referring to here is I talk about what I call the great conversation of humankind. And that's when we all get together. And when I say we all, I don't care whether you're a primitive tribes person in New Guinea or a stockbroker in New York. When all of us talk about how we humans ought to live and what the world's made of and all that, that's part of a great conversation. Now, a big part of that great conversation is obviously moral. And when we take a look at the big issues of how we ought to treat one another, don't we want to get it right? One of the unfortunate things in recent history, and largely caused by what we academics have said to the public, has made the public think that all of morality is nothing more than a set of social conventions. Just depends on wherever you were brought up, your family, where you were born. And that makes all of morality nothing more than a historical accident. There's no distinction between Adolf Hitler and Mother Teresa. Surely there's got to be more than that. You can go back to our last session and earlier today and remember we talked about the moral foundation, and that was cooperation. That's what lets the species survive. And the heart of that is that network of promising. We want to reach for truth. And what is truth? Truth is not inside anybody's head. Think about it. Doubting is a verb, and doubt is a noun. Believe is a verb, and a belief is a noun. Opinion making is a verb, an opinion is a noun. All those are mental events. Truth is a noun. There is no truthing. That's significant that there's no verb form of truth. One of the things that tells us is that truth is not inside human heads. Knowledge is a noun, knowing is a verb. Truth and knowledge are not the same thing. Knowledge is the closest approximation of truth. So what is truth? Truth is that ideal that we reach for when we try to grasp the reality of how things are, whether it's in physics or even in the moral world. We try to, in a moral world, grasp the truth of what is the best way for us to do right by one another. A truth that, for example, I have, and I suspect many of you have as well, and I can't guarantee it as a truth. I'm just a human being. I can't guarantee much of anything. But I think my reach in this moral domain, in this part of the great conversation of humankind, to grasp the truth, has been largely successful in this case, and that's true. I think slavery is wrong. Now, you can tell me, well, we did slavery in different places around the world. In fact, we pretty much did it all around the world at different times. And you're quite right about that as a historical fact. But don't you think it's a moral advance to move away from slavery? I don't make apologies for being opposed to slavery. I think I've come as close to truth when I express opposition to slavery as I do when I say something exotic about physics, such as black hole radiation exists, and the efforts of Stephen Hawking made that evident. I think both are quite a reach toward the truth and actual representation of reality, one in the moral world, one in the world of physics.
Well said. So this wraps up our session for today. Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for the time. Join us next time when we discuss moral theory in detail, and we'll record episode 3 with that as the theme and our prompt. Dr. Wagner, once again, I want to thank you for enlightening us with this knowledge, and paving a way for us to follow the moral architect as future educators.
Thank you for your kind hosting.
Thank you.